Hi. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here, actually. I really love South Africa, and I very much like Joburg. I think it's a culturally rich city with amazing people, and it's a great pleasure to come back every time. So I want to thank the guys from Amaze for inviting me to speak. So I run a small indie studio based in Lagos, Nigeria. My name is Hugo. I'm from Maliyo Games. We've actually been around since 2012, mainly focusing on Africa-themed mobile games. It's interesting speaking to a lot of the indie developers here because a lot of the folks seem to focus on online and PC games, which is very interesting because we specialize or focus on mobile, which is a lot more competitive than I guess like with the PC market. But most of my talk is actually going to center around the experience I have and a few of the other studios who are based in Nigeria have around developing games. So I've titled my talk the Seven Lives, Seven Lives Before It's Game Over. So essentially looking at big challenges that we face developing games in Nigeria. Some of these challenges, I guess, would transcend borders. So the developers here in South Africa might face them as well, and maybe some of them are quite unique to us being in Nigeria. So I'll start by talking a little bit about the Nigerian market. It's actually a very large market for those of you who know. We have a very large population, so about 190 million people. Smartphone penetration is about 28 million, and that is it's kind of like one of the largest in the world. I think it's the seventh largest in the world in terms of the mobile market. It's much bigger than that. So we actually have about 95 million mobile users, of which 28 million are using smartphones. In terms of the mobile market itself, 2016 we saw about 32 million downloads on Android and iOS only, and the cumulative gaming revenue in Nigeria was about 174 million. And most of those are actually on mobile because we don't have a lot of data on consoles. And the PC market and the online market is actually very small because of high data cost and the fact that 95% of the internet traffic in Nigeria goes via mobile phones. So PCs are not necessarily as prevalent or readily available as it might be in other markets. So that's part of the reason why we focus on mobile, because we build games primarily starting for Nigeria, and then hopefully we can go beyond Nigeria further down the line. So the first big challenge that we have, the studios in Nigeria have, is infrastructure. Now, I guess again, infrastructure is something that everyone faces. Infrastructural challenges is something that people face, challenges that people face in different parts of the world. But our unique challenge with infrastructure actually comes with power. So we have a very, very, very epileptic power supply. And what that means is that most of the individuals, and these are both businesses and residents, provide their own power. So we have like these humongous generators and diesel generators that we use for alternative power supply. And what that means is that essentially you have very, very, very high operating costs because, as you know, to do game development, you need to have PCs. The PCs need power. Your internet connectivity requires power. So you essentially can't work if you don't have power. And if the power grids are not providing you with power, then you have to provide alternative power, which obviously racks up your costs. We have a very, very, very congested transportation network. For example, most of the guys in my team live far away from the office and spend about 4 hours in commute every single day to work. So again, that provides its own unique challenge because we are based in Lagos. Lagos is one of the most populated cities in the world. We have about 20 million people in Lagos. And the transport infrastructure, or the road networks is pretty bad. It's just pretty much public transport, and it's public road transport, so we don't have like a train system or rail system as you do, for instance, in Joburg. So that again creates its own unique challenge in that most people have to commute from home to work. Working at home is a little bit more challenging because of the power situation. So we don't necessarily do the distributed remote work because of that. And obviously we also have like high data cost as well. And then on top of that, Lagos is actually a very expensive city. The rent you pay for like office space in Lagos is pretty high compared to like other cities in the world. Actually, way cheaper than like Joburg and Cape Town, for instance. So we would spend about $10,000 to $15,000 a year in rent alone, and that doesn't include the cost of providing power and obviously providing internet, which are also very, very high in Nigeria. So, so that's the very first one. I mean, like, we are seeing solutions around power, for instance. At the moment, the power grid is actually improving, and then we're also seeing more co-working spaces, which means that obviously we can share the cost with other businesses. And even at the moment, we also use a co-working space, so we actually share the office with some other businesses, and that enables us to share the cost amongst ourselves. The second big challenge, sorry, this is. The second big challenge is actually around talent. Now, again, like I think, like, this is not unique to Nigeria. This is a global problem. But the big challenge that we have is that a lot of the guys who work within the gaming industry in Nigeria are self-taught individuals. So these are pretty much, like the academic institutions have no specific program. So this is across the board, like the universities in Nigeria, there are no academies or no institute that focus on game design or game development. So the best you can get is pretty much computer science graduates. And the computer science graduates do not necessarily come with sort of like diverse skill sets and tool sets. So typically, most of the people that you can actually hire are people who have a passion for game development, have played around with engines like Unity, and essentially are learning on the job. So very, very difficult to actually find experienced individuals. The great thing, however, is on the artistic side, actually, we have a very strong art community. So we're very big on our comics. We're very big on illustrations. So it's a lot easier to actually hire artists than actually hire developers. And what that means, essentially, especially on the developer side, is that when they come in, we have to provide training for them. And for the most part, what we're doing is actually using like online resources. So whether it's on Unity, Udemy, Udacity, YouTube, to provide training resources. Obviously, because we're providing them with infrastructure, so PCs, internet connectivity is a lot easier. Because actually, the cost of internet does have an impact on people's ability to self-train. So what you will find with a lot of like developers is they somehow manage to like download. So maybe one person downloads the file, a training video, and then that video is actually distributed offline, as opposed to people having easy access to the internet and being able to download like limitless amount of content over the internet. It's mostly offline connectivity and offline distribution of a lot of these materials. So most of the guys who are self-taught, even though they are obviously they're doing this themselves, what you find is that the materials that they're using are mostly old, and that is because it's quite expensive to download these videos because of the average size of them. So we have to then do that, and then obviously there's a further down the line challenge of like retention, because people sort of like move on, they sort of like lose the passion or lose the interest, and then move on, and then you have to go through that cycle again. At the moment, that's the big concern or big challenge for us, because the moment you lose, because the community is not very, very, very large, the moment you lose somebody, you have to like go through a cycle all over again, and that can be quite a pain. So we talked about mobile. In deciding, like, we know mobile is very challenging because obviously it's a very, there's a high volume of content being pushed on the app stores on a daily basis. And these are global, this content is coming from like indie studios, it's coming from AAA studios. Some of them have like really, really, really high quality, and they're very diverse. And people's attention spans are reducing more and more and more every single day. But however, because we have a very large mobile market, we've decided to like concentrate. And most of the studios in Nigeria, actually, all the studios in Nigeria focus on mobile. So I don't think we have any studios who are doing any PCs or online games. Everyone is like focused on mobile. When we started off, we actually started by doing like online browser games, but quickly realized that the local market that we're trying to serve, was moving on to mobile, and that was where we had to go. So currently we build mainly for like Android, because like 97% of the smartphones used in Nigeria are Android devices, because of like the low cost Android phones that are kind of like entering into the market. On the journal side, what we found is that we found like three games, Temple Run, Candy Crush, and Subway Surf, have appeared in the top 5 most downloaded games since 2012 in Nigeria. So like they've consistently appeared in the top 5 most downloaded games. So obviously Nigerians like they like like your action arcade style games. They love your casual mobile games, and that's kind of like the types of games that we actually then go on to build. In terms of complexity, our games are pretty much easy to play, fun, and they're built around local characters, local environments, local sounds, and local titles. And we found that to be something that people generally respond very positively to. So when we go to like events and we're doing exhibitions, we have parents who come in and they're very, because there's this shift in culture where kids are using their parents' devices, mobile tablets, to access games. They are quite appreciative that there is a local company in Nigeria that's creating games that are a lot more relevant, or a lot more relatable, not necessarily, both relevant and relatable. And that's what they want to foster. They want to foster their kids to embrace content that has local culture or some kind of local storytelling within it. So that is what we continue to do from a content standpoint. The other big side is investment, and again, like this is something that when we travel around the world and when we meet like different developers, again, like anybody who's working in the startup space, investment is always a big concern. But what we found is obviously like most startups across the globe, you start off with like friends and family, your own little savings, and that's how we started off. So we self-invested. But we're seeing a lot more traction. Nigeria's a very interesting country in that we top the charts in the most amount of internet traffic coming through mobile browsers globally. So in the last sort of like 12 to 18 months, we've had visits by Mark Zuckerberg. We had the Google CEO coming 2 months ago. So we're getting like this heavy traffic from like, tech CEOs, Y Combinator, 500 startups are coming to Lagos to really sort of like embrace and understand what this market is about. So if you look at like, I guess like the BRIC countries or the next frontier, so obviously China is right here, right now. You've got Brazil, you've got India, everyone is looking like 5 years down the line that Nigeria potentially could be that next huge market for mobile content and digital content. So we're seeing a lot more seed investment. I mean, we've gone through 2 rounds of seed investments in the last 2 years. And again, like a lot of like the VCs are also looking to invest. Obviously, gaming is an interesting space because of the monetization opportunities. But on the content side, obviously, there's a lot of like interest in what we're doing at the moment, and if we potentially can actually break that mode of like not just focusing on the local market, but actually going beyond the local markets. So that's something that we're still very much actively talking to investors and talking to like funders to see how we can continue to support our studio. Now, again, like most indie developers or most studios, distribution is a massive concern, right? So for us at the moment, obviously you have like the major app stores, the iOS, the Android stores. We focus very much on Android because our market is 97% Android users. But you also have like third-party app stores. No, third-party app stores are telco-owned app stores. The telcos control the mobile space. So you have like big players like MTN, a South African company who's based in Nigeria. You have Airtel, an Indian company, and then you also have Nine Mobile, where it used to be Etisalat, which was a Middle Eastern company, but now it's kind of like changed to like a Nigerian-owned company. But they all have their own app stores, and they are doing quite significant revenues because they have direct access to the users, and they have direct access to the users because the users are on their mobile network. And at the moment, they're sort of like they offer alternative option to access the local markets, the local consumers for monetization, because most of the monetization is driven by some kind of like subscription model and the ability for people to pay for content using airtime as opposed to using card. Now, we'll talk about monetization in a little bit, but this is actually very important. But Nigeria also has a unique distribution model in that a lot of content that is actually distributed actually happens offline. And the reason for that is because of data costs. So I'll tell you a story. I was interviewing for a content a content marketing assistant a couple of months ago, and during the interview, I asked the individual, "Have you actually downloaded any of our games?" And they said, "No, they haven't." And I said, "Why? Why haven't you? You're coming for an interview. I would expect that you would have at least downloaded one of our games." And they said they didn't have sufficient data. And I said, "How come you don't have sufficient data? Because we've been exchanging emails." And then they said, "Well, I've got about 20 megabytes of data left. So I was reserving that for my email communication. And I felt like, obviously, if I download one of your games, I might run out of data." So what you find is, you have this huge number of like internet users on their mobile phones, but they're very, very, very conscious of the cost of being on the internet. So you almost have this limited use of internet. And that has actually created an offline distribution market because people are somewhat wary of the cost of downloading. What happens is that they actually go to the technology markets distributed across the country, and they have these individuals that actually install the apps on their devices using a USB stick connected to a PC. And this is a trend across the country. And that's actually that method is also used for like video distribution, for music distribution, for software distribution, of all sorts. So essentially, it's a much cheaper way for people to access the content that they need on their mobile devices. So we are also tapping into that because you have to follow your market, and if that is how people are behaving, then essentially you have to adjust to that. The next big challenge for us is around monetization. And again, now, of the $174 million that was generated in gaming revenue, paid content represents less than 1%. Most of that revenue was actually done on in-app purchases. And what we find is that Nigerians don't like paying for stuff. This might be similar in a lot of other markets, but obviously the freemium model works much better. But you then also have the issue around the form of payment. Now, card penetration is extremely low. It's about 4% of the working adults who have cards. And then, for the most part, people don't have their cards integrated into their mobile device. So there is this frictional component of making payments. So, when people are playing a game like Candy Crush or Subway Surf and they get to the payment part of it, they go through that journey of, I want to buy this item, but then they get stuck because they said, "Oh, input your card details." And, we still have, like most third world countries or most emerging markets, we still have that issue around trust. And people don't then go ahead to input their card details, and that's where it gets stopped. And sort of like the work around that at the moment is looking at enabling people to actually pay for items using their airtime, because then it's attached to some kind of like mobile wallet or mobile credit, which is detached from like your bank account. And ads is kind of like the way that is the default monetization method. So most games will have a combination of like freemium and ad-based revenue. But the ad-based revenue at the moment, again, is not fantastic, unless of course you have cross-border users on your network. And then the final area. A challenge opportunity for us is pretty much around looking beyond the Nigerian market, looking beyond the African market, and looking at the global market. And what I've done here is kind of like made references to Nollywood. Nollywood is the Nigerian movie industry, which is extremely successful, both at home and abroad. Looking at Afrobeats. Afrobeats is kind of like a genre that Nigerians kind of like adopted. And Nigerian music, has really, really, really transformed or at least I made a huge transformation and contribution to the African music space, where you go to like popular clubs in cities like New York, in London, in Paris, and this is something that is in high demand. And the interesting thing is, back in 2010, this wasn't the case. In 2010, if you went to a club in Lagos, 90% of the music tracks that you would listen to were American tracks. They were Western tracks, and this was in Lagos, Nigeria. And by 2013, 2014, it was the other way around. Like, it was a complete switch where, every party you go to, whether it's a private party, like a gig, and it was just pure Nigerian music. And it's kind of crazy because where we're staying currently at the Bannister, I mean, I still find it fascinating every time I go anywhere in the world, and, I can hear Nigerian music being played. And it's not just a one-off, it's just a back-to-back-to-back series of like songs that everybody is accustomed to, whether they know it's Nigerian or not. Obviously, we understand that. So essentially what we're trying to say is these two forms of media that have been hugely successful, are we potentially going to see that same success emerge in games? I mean, like, it might not necessarily be led by Maliyo Games, it might be led by a different gaming company, but are we going to see global demand for content coming out of Nigeria? And that's pretty much my presentation. Thank you very much.